Part 2: The Fall. Man's natural state was mutable. The devil, moved by hatred and envy, attempts to seduce him. The temptation was suitable to man's compounded nature. The woman, being deceived, persuades her husband. The quality of the first sin. Many were combined in it. It was perfectly voluntary. Man had power to stand. The devil could only allure, not compel him. His understanding and will the causes of his fall. The punishment was of the same date with his sin. He forfeited his righteousness and felicity. The loss of original righteousness, as it signifies the purity and liberty of the soul. The torment of conscience that was consequent to sin. A whole army of evils enter with it into the world. Man was created perfectly holy, but in a natural, therefore mutable state. He was invested with power to prevent his falling, yet under a possibility of it. He was complete in his own order, but receptive of sinful impressions. An invincible perseverance in holiness belongs to a supernatural state. It is the privilege of grace, and exceeds the design of the first creation. The rebellious spirits, who by a furious ambition had raised a war in heaven, and were fallen from their obedience and glory, designed to corrupt man, and to make him a companion with them in their revolt. The most subtle amongst them sets about this work, urged by two strong passions, hatred and envy. Point 1. By hatred. For being under a final and irrevocable doom, he looked on God as an irreconcilable enemy, and not being able to injure his essence, he struck at his image, as the fury of some beasts discharges itself upon the picture of a man. He singled out Adam as the mark of his malice, that by seducing him from his duty, he might defeat God's design, which was to be honored by man's free obedience, and so obscure his glory as if he had made man in vain. Point 2. He was solicited by envy, the first native of hell, for having lost the favor of God, and being cast out of heaven, the region of joy and blessedness. The sight of Adam's felicity exasperated his grief. That man, who by the condition of his nature was below him, should be prince of the world, whilst he was a prisoner under those chains which restrained and tormented him, the power and wrath of God, this made his state more intolerable. His torment was incapable of allay, but by rendering man as miserable as himself. And as hatred excited his envy, so envy inflamed his hatred, and both joined in mischief. And thus pushed on, his subtlety being equal to his malice, he contrives a temptation which might be most taking and dangerous to man in his raised and happy state. He attempts him with art, by propounding the lure of knowledge and pleasure, to inveigle the spiritual and sensitive appetites at once. And that he might the better succeed, he addresses to the woman, the weakest and most liable to seduction. He hides himself in the body of a serpent, which before sin was not terrible unto her, and by this instrument insinuates his temptation. He first allures with the hopes of impunity, ye shall not die, then he promises an universal knowledge of good and evil. By these pretenses he ruined innocence itself. For the woman, deceived by those specious electives, swallowed the poison of the serpent, and having tasted death, she persuaded her husband, by the same motives, to despise the law of their Creator. Thus sin entered, and brought confusion into the world. For the moral harmony of the world, consisting in the just subordination of the several ranks of beings to one another, and of all to God, when man who was placed next to God broke the union, his toil brought a desperate disorder into God's government. And though the matter of the offense seems small, yet the disobedience was infinitely great, it being the transgression of that command, which was given to be the instance and real proof of man's subjection to God. He, in that commandment of legal obedience, violates the whole law. Tertullian. The honor and majesty of the whole law was violated in the breach of that symbolical precept. It was a direct and formal rebellion, a public renunciation of obedience, and universal apostasy from God, and change of the last end, that extinguished the habit of original righteousness. Many sins were combined in that single act. Subpoint 1. Infidelity. This was the first step to ruin. It appears by the order of the temptation. It was first said by the devil, "Ye shall not die," to weaken their faith, then, "Ye shall be like gods," to flatter their ambition. The fear of death would have controlled the efficacy of all his arguments, till that restraint was broke, he could fasten nothing upon them. This account the apostle gives of the fall, 1 Timothy 2:14. The woman being deceived, was in the transgression. As obedience is the effect of faith, so disobedience of infidelity, and as faith comes by hearing the word of God, so infidelity by listening to the words of the devil. From the deception of the mind proceeded the deprivation of the will, the intemperance of the appetite, and the defection of the whole man. Thus as the natural, so the spiritual death made its first entrance by the eye. And this infidelity is extremely aggravated, as it implies an accusation of God both of envy and falsehood. 1. Of envy, as if he had denied them the perfections becoming the human nature, and they might ascend to a higher orb than that wherein they were placed, by eating the forbidden fruit. And what greater disparagement could there be of the divine goodness, than to suspect the deity of such a low and base passion, which is the special character of the angels of darkness? 2. It was equally injurious to the honor of God's truth. For it is not easy to conceive, that Adam, who was so lately the effect of God's omnipotence, should presently distrust it as unable to inflict the punishment threatened. But his assent was weakened as to the truth of the threatening. He did not believe the danger to be so great or certain upon his disobedience. And he that believes not God makes him a liar. 1 John 5:16. An impiety not to be thought on without horror. And that which heightens the affront is, that when he distrusted the fountain of truth, he gave credit to the father of lies, as appears by his compliance, the real evidence of his faith. Now what viler contumely could be offered to the Creator? Subpoint 2. Prodigious pride. He was scarce out of the state of nothing, no sooner created, but he aspired to be as God. Not content with his image, he affected an equality, to be like him in his inimitable attributes. He would rob God of his eternity to live without end, of his sovereignty, to command without dependence, of his wisdom to know all things without reserve. Infinite insolence. And worthy of the most fiery indignation. That man, the son of the earth, forgetful of his original, should usurp the prerogatives which are essential to the deity, and set up himself a real idol, was a strain of that arrogancy which corrupted the angels. Subpoint 3. Horrid ingratitude. He was appointed heir apparent of all things, yet undervaluing his present portion, he entertains a project of improving his happiness. The excellent state newly conferred upon him was a strong obligation to pay so small an acknowledgment to his Lord. The use of all the garden was allowed to him, only a tree excepted. Now in the midst of such variety and plenty, to be inflamed with the intemperate appetite of the forbidden fruit, and to break a command so equal and easy, what was it but a despising the rich goodness of his great benefactor? Besides, man was endued with a diviner spirit than the inferior order of creatures. Reason and liberty were the special privileges of his nature, and, to abuse them to rebellion, renders him, as more unreasonable, so more disingenuous than the creatures below him, who inflexibly obey the will of God. Subpoint 4. The visible contempt of God's majesty, with a slighting his justice. For the prohibition was so express and terrible, that till he had cast off all respects to the lawgiver, it was not possible he should venture to disobey him. The sin of Adam is therefore called by the Apostle, disobedience, Romans 5:19, as eminently such, it being the first and highest instance of it, and virtually a breach of all the laws at once in that contempt of the lawgiver. It was the profanation of paradise itself, the place of God's special presence. There he fell, and trampled on God's command before his face. What just cause of astonishment is it, that a reasonable creature should bid open defiance to the author of its life? That a little breathing dust should contemn its creator? That man should prefer servile compliance to the will of the tempter, before free subjection to his Father and Sovereign? To depose God, and place the devil in his throne, was double treason, and provoked his infinite jealousy. Subpoint 5. Unaccountable and amazing folly. What a despicable acquisition tempted him out of happiness! If there had been any possible comparison between them, the choice had been more excusable. But that the pleasures of taste and curiosity should outvie the favor of God, which is better than life, that the most pernicious evil, gilded with the thin appearance of good, should be preferred before the substantial and supreme good, is the reproach of his reason, and makes the choice so criminal. And what less than voluntary madness could incline him to desire that which he ought infinitely to have feared, that is, the knowledge of evil? For nothing could destroy his happiness but the experience of evil. What a willful distraction could induce him to believe that by defacing God's image, he should become more like him? Thus, man being in honor, but without understanding, became like the beasts that perish. Psalm 49:12. Subpoint 6. A bloody cruelty to himself, and to all his posterity. When God had made him a depositary, in a matter of infinite moment, that is, of his own happiness and all mankind's, this should have been a powerful motive to have kept him vigilant, but giving a ready ear to the tempter, he betrayed his trust, and, at once, breaks both the tables of the law, and becomes guilty of the highest impiety and cruelty. He was a murderer before a parent, he disinherited all his children before they were born, and made them slaves before they knew the price of liberty. And that which increases the malignity of this sin, and adds an infinite emphasis to it, is, that it was perfectly voluntary. His will was the sole cause of his fall. And this is evident by considering 1. That Adam innocent had a sufficient power to persevere in his holy state. There was no subtraction of any grace which was requisite to his standing. He left God before he was forsaken by him. Much less was there any internal impulsion from God. It is inconsistent with the divine purity to incline the creature to sin, as God cannot be tempted to evil, neither tempts he any man. It is injurious to his wisdom to think that God would spoil that work which he had composed with so much design and counsel. And it is dishonorable to his goodness. He loved his creature, and love is an inclination to do good. It was impossible therefore for God to induce man to sin, or to withdraw that power which was necessary to resist the temptation, when the consequence must be his inevitable ruin. 2. The devil did only allure, he could not ravish his consent. Though his malice is infinite, yet his power is so restrained, that he cannot fasten an immediate, much less an irresistible impression on the will. He therefore made use of an external object to invite him. Now objects have no constraining force, they are but partial agents, and derive all their efficacy from the faculties to which they are agreeable. And although, since sin hath disordered the flesh, there is difficulty in resisting those objects which pleasantly insinuate themselves, yet such an universal rectitude was in Adam, and so entire a subjection in the sensual appetite to the superior power of reason, that he might have obtained an easy conquest. A resolute negative had made him victorious, by a strong denial he had baffled that proud spirit. As the heavenly Adam, when he, who is only rich in promises, offered to him the monarchy of the world with all its glory, disdained the offer, and cast off Satan with contempt. The true rock was unmoved, and broke all the proud waves that dashed against it. 3. It will fully appear that the disobedience was voluntary, by considering what denominates an action to be so. The two springs of human actions are the understanding and will, and as there is no particular good but may have the appearance of some difficult unpleasant quality annexed, upon which account the will may reject it, so any particular evil may be so disguised by the false lustre of goodness as to incline the will to receive it. This is clearly verified in Adam's fall. For a specious object was conveyed through the unguarded sense to his fancy, and from that to his understanding, which, by a vicious carelessness, neglecting to consider the danger, or judging that the excellency of the end did outweigh the evil of the means, commended it to the will, and that resolved to embrace it. It is evident therefore, that the action which resulted from the direction of the mind, and the choice of the will, was absolutely free. Besides, as the regret that is mixed with an action, is a certain character that the person is under constraint, so the delight that attends it is a clear evidence that he is free. When the appetite is drawn by the lure of pleasure, James 1:14, the more violent, the more voluntary is its motion. Now the representations of the forbidden fruit were under the notion of pleasure. The woman saw that fruit was good for food, that is, pleasurable to the palate, and pleasant to the eyes, and to be desired to make one wise. Genesis 3:6. That is, to increase knowledge, which is the pleasure of the mind, and these electives draw her into the snare. Adam with complacency received the temptation, and by the enticement of Satan, committed adultery with the creature, from whence the cursed race of sin and miseries proceed. Suppose the devil had so disguised the temptation, that notwithstanding all circumspection and care, Adam could not have discovered its evil. His invincible ignorance had rendered the action involuntary, but Adam was conscious of his own action. There was light in his mind to discern the evil, and strength in his will to decline it. For the manner of the defection, whether it was from affected ignorance, or secure neglect, or transport of passion, it doth not excuse. The action itself was of that moment, and the supreme lawgiver so worthy of reverence, that it should have awakened all the powers of his soul to beware of that which was rebellion against God, and ruin to himself. Or suppose he had been tried by torments, whose extremity and continuance had vehemently oppressed his nature, this had only lessened the guilt, the action had still been voluntary, for no external force can compel the will to choose anything but under the notion of comparative goodness. Job 36:21. Now to choose sin rather than pains, and to prefer ease before obedience, is highly dishonorable to God, whose glory ought to be infinitely more valuable to us than life, and all its endearments. And though sharp pains, by composing the body, make the soul unfit for its highest and noblest operations, so that it cannot perform the acts of virtue with delight and freedom, yet then it may abstain from evil. But this was not Adam's case. The devil had no power over him, as over Job, who felt the extremity of his rage, and yet came off more than conqueror. To disturb his felicity, he prevailed by a simple suasion. Briefly, though Adam had strength sufficient to repel all the powers of darkness, yet he was vanquished by the assault of a single temptation. Now that man so richly furnished with all the perfections of the mind, and the excellent virtues of which original righteousness was composed, that endued with knowledge to foresee the incomparable evil that would redound to himself, and the universal to his posterity by his disobedience, that being so well tempered in his constitution, that all his appetites were subject to reason, that notwithstanding these preservatives, he should be deceived by the false persuasion of an erring mind, and overcome by carnal concupiscence. As the evil effects of it will not cease to the end of the world, nor the just wonder how it was possible to happen, these are the circumstances which derive a crimson guilt to his rebellious sin, and render it above measure sinful. This will more fully appear in the dreadful effects that ensued. By his disobedience he lost original righteousness, and made a deadly forfeiture of felicity. 1. He lost original righteousness, for that so depended on the human faculties, that the actual violation of the law was presently attended with the privation of it. Besides, the nature of his sin contained an entire forsaking of God, as envious of his happiness, and a conversion to the creature as the supreme good. And whatever is desired as the last end perfective of man, virtually includes all subordinate ends, and regulates all means for obtaining it. So that being changed, a universal change of moral qualities in Adam necessarily followed. Instead of the rectitude and excellent holiness of the soul, succeeded a permanent viciousness and corruption. Now holiness may be considered in the notion of purity and beauty, or of dominion and liberty, in opposition to which sin is represented in Scripture by foul deformity and servitude. 1. His soul degenerated from its purity, the faculties remained, but the moral perfections were lost, wherein the brightness of God's image was most conspicuous. The holy wisdom of his mind, the divine love, that sanctified his will, the spiritual power, to obey God, were totally quenched. How is man disfigured by his fall? How is he transformed, in an instant, from the image of God into the image of the devil? He is defiled with the filthiness of flesh and spirit. He is ashamed at the sight of his own nakedness that reproached him for his crime, but the most shameful was that of the soul. The one might be covered with leaves, the other nothing could conceal. To see a face of exquisite beauty devoured by a cancer, how doth it move compassion? But were the natural eye heightened to that clearness and perspicacity, as to discover the deformity which sin hath brought upon the soul, how would it strike us with grief, horror, and aversion? 2. He was deprived of his dominion and liberty. The understanding was so wounded by the violence of the fall, that not only its light is much impaired, but its power is so weakened, as to the lower faculties, that those, which according to the order of nature, should obey, have cast off its just authority, and usurped the government. The will hath lost its true freedom, whereby it was enlarged to the extent and amplitude of the divine will, in loving whatsoever was pleasing to God, and is contracted to mean and base objects. What a furious disorder is in the affections! The restraint of reason to check their violent course, provokes them to swell higher, and to be more impetuous, and the more they are gratified, the more insolent and outrageous they grow. The senses, whose office is to be intelligences of the soul, to make discovery, and to give a naked report, without disturbing the higher faculties, they sometimes mistake disguised enemies for friends, and sometimes by a false alarm move the lower appetites, and fill the soul with disorder and confusion, that the voice of reason cannot be heard. By the irritation of grief, the insinuation of pleasure, or some other perturbation, the soul is captivated and wounded through the senses. In short, when man turned rebel to God, he became a slave to all the creatures. By their primitive institution they were appointed to be subservient to the glory of God, and the use of man, to be motives of love and obedience to the Creator. But sin hath corrupted and changed them into so many instruments of vice, they are made subject to vanity. Romans 8:20. And man is so far sunk into the dregs of servitude, that he is subject to them. For by forsaking God, the supreme object of love, with as much injustice as folly, and choosing the creature in his stead, he becomes a servant to the meanest thing upon which he places an inordinate affection. Briefly, man, who by his creation was the Son of God, is made a slave to Satan, that damned spirit and most cursed creature. Deplorable degradation! And worthy of the deepest shame and sorrow. 2. Man lost his felicity. Besides the trouble that sinneth in its own nature, which I have touched on before, there is a consequent guilt and torment attends it. Adam, whilst obedient, enjoyed peace with God, a sweet serenity of mind, divine calm in the conscience, and full satisfaction in himself. But after his sin, he trembled at God's voice, and was tormented at his presence. I heard thy voice, and was afraid, saith guilty Adam, Genesis 3:10. He looked on God as angry, and armed against him, ready to execute the severe sentence. Conscience began an early hell within him. Paradise with all its pleasures could not secure him from that sting in his breast, and that sharpened by the hand of God. What confusion of thoughts, what a combat of passions was he in! When the temptation which deceived him vanished, and his spirit recovered out of the surprise, and took a clear view of his guilt in its true horror, what indignation did it kindle in his breast! How did shame, sorrow, revenge, despair, those secret executioners, torment his spirit! The intelligent nature, his peculiar excellency above the brutes, armed misery against him, and put a keener edge to it. 1. By reflecting upon the foolish exchange he made of God himself for the fruit of a tree, that so slender a temptation should cheat him of his blessedness. His present misery is aggravated by the sad comparison of it with his primitive felicity. Nothing remains of his first innocence, but the vexatious regret of having lost it. 2. By the foresight of the death he deserved. The conscience of his crimes racked his soul with a certain and fearful expectation of judgment. Besides the inward torment of his mind, he was exposed to all miseries from without. Sin having made a breach into the world, the whole army of evils entered with it. The curse extends itself to the whole creation. For the world being made for man, the place of his residence, in his punishment it hath felt the effects of God's displeasure. The whole course of nature is set on fire. Whereas a general peace and amicable correspondence were established between heaven and earth, whilst all were united in subjection to the Creator, sin that broke the first union between God and man hath ruined the second. As in a state when one part of the subjects fall from their obedience, the rest which are constant in their duty, break with the rebels, and make war upon them till they return to their allegiance, so universal nature was armed against rebellious man, and had destroyed him without the merciful interposition of God. The angels with flaming swords expelled him from paradise. The beasts who were all innocent, whilst man remained innocent, espouse God's interest, and are ready to revenge the quarrel of their Creator. The insensible creation which at first was altogether beneficial to man, is become hurtful. The heavens sometimes are hardened as brass in a long and obstinate serenity, sometimes are dissolved in a deluge of rain. The earth is barren, and unfaithful to the sower, it brings forth thorns and thistles, instead of bread. Genesis 3:17 and 18. In short, man is an enemy to man. When there were but two brothers to divide the world, the one stained his hands in the blood of the other. And since the progeny of Adam is increased into vast societies, all the disasters of the world, as famine, pestilence, deluges, the fury of beasts have not been so destructive of mankind, as the sole malignity of man against those that partake of the human nature. To conclude, who can make a list of the evils to which the body is liable by the disagreeing elements that compose it? The fatal seeds of corruption are bred in itself. It is a prey to all diseases, from the torturing stone to the dying consumption. It feels the strokes of death 1,000 times before it can die once. At last, life is swallowed up of death. And if death were a deliverance from miseries, it would lessen its terror, but it is the consummation of all. The first death transmits to the second. As the body dies by the soul's forsaking it, so the soul, by separation from God, its true life, dies to its well-being and happiness forever.